The album I'm going to be talking about today is easily the most disturbing album that I own. And if you are sensitive to real life gore, then I encourage you not to look up this album cover or other album covers by this artist. You have been warned. If you are new to watching this series, I have one previous video for you that I will link here that is the first installment of this most disturbing albums series. So you can watch that after this one. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this album and this band, I do want to mention the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the hearts that are used to cover most of this album. Now, I'm not doing this really to censor the album for y'all, because I know that y'all metalheads have most likely seen this cover, and you've definitely seen some pretty gory stuff in the metal music community. I am just doing this so that Daddy YouTube is happy and that I can keep my video up. If you hear a squeaky toy also in the background, it is my bloodhound Rusty. Today we're going to be talking about the legendary Dutch gore grind band Last Days of Humanity and their debut record, The Sounds of Rancid Juices Sloshing Around Your Coffin. That is the new most disturbing metal album in my collection. If you are not familiar with Last Days of Humanity, they are a gore grind band that was formed in Noord-Brabant, Netherlands in 1989. I probably butchered that saying, but you get the point. There are two original band members. The first is Erwin de Witt, who plays bass, and Hans Smits as the vocalist. And like a lot of bands, Last Days of Humanity was plagued with a lot of band member turnover. However, the original lineup at the time of this record's release, other than the two original band members I just mentioned, consisted of Anne van de Burgt and William van de Ven playing guitars, and Glenn Yeager on drums. This is the band's first full-length album, which was officially released in 1998 on Bones Brigade Records and reissued on vinyl through Fat Ass Records in 2013. And this copy that I have on vinyl, I purchased from Hell's Headbangers, which if you are interested in picking up a copy for yourself, I will link it down below. This full-length debut is the follow-up to two demos that began their career. They have a self-titled demo from 1992 called Last Days of Humanity and Human Atrocity, which came out in 1993. They also did several splits prior to the release of this debut, which included their 1994 split EP with Vulgar Degenerate, their 1995 split Pathological Dreams with Confessions of Obscurity, and in 1996 they split with Rhicitus called Defleshed by Flies. Now, this band visually is probably the most disgusting band I've ever come across, and I say that as a compliment. Their album covers are so awful that I actually got quite nauseous just looking at them. Every single split and EP leading up to this album has real-life images of gore, usually with some poor dead person on the cover. And up until their debut, the worst cover they released was actually their split with Rhicitus, which was a full-color photo of a person with their throat skin pulled over their face. The tamest album art being the black and white cover from their 1994 split with Vulgar Degenerate. Now, tame for gore grind standards. I mean, there's still a dead dude on the cover, but it's black and white and it's kind of fuzzy, so it's not as bad. The gore escalates in the debut, however, as the band decided to use what looks like real evidence photos as the cover of their album. The gore was so bad that it got to the point where if I wanted to listen to this band, I had to make sure that I hadn't eaten anything prior or that I wasn't about to eat, because it would make me that nauseous. And I have never had such a response to an album before in my life. And what's funny is the best way that I was able to actually dive in and enjoy this album was when I ended up getting sick with a fever, and I just was like, I want to listen to that, and I threw it on and sat in my beanbag and was just vibing, and it was great. I also ended up getting a stomach bug the next day, so Now, Sounds of Rancid Juices was the first album ever released on Bone Brigade Records and was recorded in the time from September 22nd to October 30th in 1996. Now, if you're not familiar with Bones Brigade Records, they're a very popular French underground label in the extreme metal scene with a focus of grindcore, hardcore, and other extreme metal genres. The band themselves have said that this album is like a Carcass worship album, and Justin Horval from Hell's Headbangers actually confirmed this idea when I asked him for help for this video. Now, Justin said, "The sound of rancid juices sloshing around your coffin is actually a lyrical quote from Carcass's Reek of Putrefaction." Now, Reek of Putrefaction is the debut album from gore grind band Carcass and was released in June of 1988, 10 years prior to Last Days of Humanity's debut album. Further research brought me to the song Psychopathologist, which contains this lyric. The final verse of the song goes as follows: "The sound of rancid juices sloshing around your coffin. The mold and the gore remind me that you're rotting. Congealed blood clotted around both sets of veins, the beautiful color of your decomposing brain." Now, to go further on this, the first two Carcass albums have images of dead body parts put over each other in what looks like some sort of twisted scrapbook. And just by looking at this, I can definitely see how Carcass inspired the album cover of Last Days of Humanity's album. Albeit Last Days is much more gory and disturbing, at least in my opinion, but more on that later. Now, many of my viewers would probably agree with me that there's a couple different ways you can do gore grind. The first is to have your music be serious and structured at the same time. And what I mean is actually writing songs, having some sort of song structure and a musical vibe and grind to it. Perfect examples of this are, of course, old school Carcass, Hemorrhage, and Exhumed. Exhumed being a really interesting case because they, like Last Days of Humanity, found a lot of inspiration from Carcass with their earlier demos, as well as their debut album from 1988 called Gore Metal, which I discovered that record, Gore Metal, actually came out a few months after Last Days of Humanity's debut. So kind of a cool timeline there. The second way to do gore grind is to have it not be taken seriously at all. To elaborate, you still make music, of course, but it's almost like you're making non-music purely just to have fun with it. There's not really a structure to the sound necessarily, or at least there really isn't a goal for one. Sometimes there's not a real direction for the album, and it's just plain and simply put existing to exist and be as shocking and as disturbing and as vile as it possibly can be. The second option would, of course, describe Last Days of Humanity's The Sound of Rancid Juices. However, I think there's also a lot of things that the band played around with on this record that make it a little bit more than just your standard wall of sound gore grind. But before we get into the actual music, I want to talk briefly about this horrible album cover. And I say that in a very positive way, again, because I really do like this album, but we can't deny that the album cover art is awful. Now, when I began my research for this video, of course, the first thing that I wanted to know was, what is the story behind the photos used on the album? Who are these people and what is it from? And why did the band decide to use these pictures of dead bodies? And I'm telling you, I researched for days and days. I tried every outlet I could to find any information. There were many people in my Discord that thought I was weird as hell for wanting to know that information. But for me, it's all about context. And I really wanted to know where these images came from and who these poor souls were. And I have to be honest and say this is one of the more difficult videos I've ever researched for. There's not a lot of information about Last Days of Humanity. I mean, there is in terms of like their discography and the origins of the band, but if you're really wanting to get some nitty-gritty details, it's difficult to find any of that. And I was struggling too because even though they used these horrible pictures, there was no photographer credited, there was no site that was credited as their source where they received these photos. They were just there, and everyone I asked for information had none to give me. And it wasn't until almost a week later that I got my first break, and I found an old interview with the singer Hans Smits from November 1st, 1997. It was printed in a Dutch metal fanzine called Master of Brutality. This fanzine focused mostly on second wave death metal and grindcore and featured interviews from many artists including Fleshcrawl and Massacre. In this interview, Hans is asked many questions about the band as well as their new debut CD, which was the most popular format for music to be printed on at the time, having taken over cassette printing in 1991. Scanning this interview, I found that the original author asked the same questions about their debut album that I and many others have been wondering about. Now, I also want to briefly mention that this magazine, Master of Brutality, is based in the Netherlands. So English is not the author's first language, and it's not Hans's first language, and you can kind of tell. So he asks, the cover of your debut CD should be one of the most brutal and glorifying covers till today. Tell us something about it. Where did you get the pictures from? Aren't you afraid that you've to cover the entire CD cover with parental advisory stickers? Hans mentions yes, with a bunch of Z's is what the author put. The cover of our debut CD is going to be one of the most brutal ever. You can compare it a bit with the albums of Dead Infection and Brujeria. The front cover shows a woman on a bed with half her head blown away. Backside of the book, it shows a man who is run over by a truck with his head off and his guts splattered all over the street. Backside of the CD shows a man whose stomach is cut open and his skin pulled over his head. And under the CD, there's a photo of somebody whose brains are shot away. All pictures are in full color and crystal clear. They are really nasty. We got them from the internet, but don't bother to find them because they are already removed. We hope that Moonlight Records is able to print them on the CD booklet. On the front cover, we'll have a black paper with our logo and title and a lot of parental advisory stickers. And after reading this answer, I'm not going to lie and say I was a bit disappointed about how they discovered these photos. I was expecting the discovery to be something a little bit more interesting other than, oh, we discovered them on the internet and just used them. This would explain why there are no credits to these photographs or to who these people were. I think it's ironic that such gory pictures were used, and yet at that point, Hans had never seen a mutilated body. He had seen deaths, but not mutilated bodies, despite using them for his album covers, and he mentions this in an interview. Before the time, I can understand why, as photos like these were very easily accessible and way less monitored and censored than they are now. For people like me that were born in the 90s or later, here's some general context as to why that matters. Considering that the internet went public in the early 1990s at this point in time for Hans Smits, this would mean that websites could be accessed basically anywhere around the world like they are today, but of course with limitations. After chatting with my Discord briefly, one of my members said that Hans probably got the photo off of a site like rotten.com or some other gore-focused site, which makes me believe that these photos are legitimate crime photos or pictures taken from whoever committed these violent acts. Which, when you think about it like that, it kind of adds to the creepiness of it all. Sure, it's gory and the pictures were definitely just used for shock value, but overall, these were real people. And there's a story here. We don't know what it is, but something awful happened to these people. And whether the victims' families know about their loved ones' photographs being used on this album cover and in this way is completely up in the air. I never came across any articles that mentioned the victims' families trying to get these photographs removed. I also want to say that I did not go out of my way to try and hunt down these photos on gore sites. Not only did I think it was a waste of time, but I'm also just not the biggest fan of gore. I don't really watch gory horror movies or stuff like that. It's not really my thing. That being said, I, like many people, do have a fascination with death and the human body. For certain things, I think there's something very shocking and terrible in it all. But for me, I have my limitations. Hypothetically speaking, let's say Hans did get these photos off the now defunct website Rotten.com. This would be highly likely because Rotten.com was published in 1996 and really began to gain traction in 1997, especially amongst teenagers around this time. This, of course, is exactly around the time when Last Days of Humanity was recording their debut, and definitely imagine a 27-year-old Hans Smits just going onto that website, looking at pictures out of pure curiosity, only to realize, holy shit, that would make an amazing album cover. But let's continue with the interview from Master of Brutality, because I think it really adds context as to the origins of this band and the graphic debut. So one of the first questions they ask is, tell us something about the Last Days debut CD. When will it be released? Are you satisfied with it? He said, we recorded it in Shijindal at Digital Music Service. Butchered that name, I apologize. It's a small but good studio. The guy who recorded it really knows what he wanted. The title of the CD is The Sound of Rancid Juices Sloshing Around Your Coffin. Now I hear you think, but we wanted a nice and simple title. The CD contains 26 tracks plus 1 and 8 intros and 1 outro. The intros and outros are taken from movies. When everything goes well, the CD will be released around February or March, and we're satisfied with it, of course. He also continues and asks, what about the lyrics? What inspires Last Days of Humanity? And he says, well, Last Days' main influences today are mostly grindcore and brutal death metal. I haven't got any lyrics. I just growl something with lots of gurgles and args. But the growls in a song are always the same. I don't use lyrics because I'm too lazy to make them up. And we aren't a band with a message. I only got one message. Do what you want as long as you don't bother me. The band was also asked about what they had previously released thus far, and that is when I learned some more information about their very first demo, which, as I mentioned, came out in 1992 and was self-titled. However, in this interview, Hans calls this demo The Dawn Has Come. Now, Hans is the one who titled this demo as such, but on Discogs, it's still referred to as the self-titled demo, and it has the tamest album cover I have ever seen from Last Days of Humanity. Now, this original demo is hard to find for obvious reasons, but don't worry, if you are still interested or wanting to pick up a copy, Last Days of Humanity did re-release it in 2021. It also remains self-titled, but it will come up in search results under the name The Dawn Has Come. Now, this isn't the first time that I've talked about Metal Archives being picky, and it certainly won't be the last, but Last Days of Humanity have never been added to Metal Archives, and I did run across an old Metal Archives forum thread from 2007 that included a person who was trying to ask the mods and give them reason why they should add Last Days of Humanity into the website, which of course never happened. And I don't understand this because there's literally a band called Final Heartbeat from Germany that are under the genre gore grind hardcore, and in 2023 they released a demo called Final Heartbeat of Humanity, a tribute to Last Days of Humanity, which includes 2 Last Days of Humanity covers on it, and yet the mods are perfectly okay with that band and those songs being on their website, but not Last Days of Humanity. So some other band can cover Last Days of Humanity and get that shit on the website, but the original creators can't get a page. Make it make sense. Now, it was mentioned earlier that there are absolutely no lyrics on this album, so don't even bother wasting your time trying to find them like I did. The best I was able able to find was a very bare bones Genius page with a bunch of typed out gurgly nonsense lyrics on it. And that is also why the vinyl itself came with an insert but no lyrics. There's more lyrics in the movie samples than there are in the actual original song, which is honestly kind of creative when you think about it, because it's almost like the metal version of scatting or scat singing, which originated with jazz music. The official definition of scat singing or scatting is vocal improvisation with wordless vocables, nonsense syllables, or without words at all. In scat singing, the singer improvises melodies and rhythms using the voice solely as an instrument rather than a speaking medium.
Gazing to the eyes of dynamite, baby, every night while I shake with right, cut my dynamite, change your mind,
This is very much a true definition for what Hans Smits does for this record. The only difference is obviously the wordless vocables and nonsense syllables are these burpy, belchy toilet sounds. And did I mention that they're also down-tuned so that they sound extra volatile? Their music was originally crafted by using two screaming voices that were deformed by a pitch shifter intended for the guitar. So I would assume this method or one similar method was used for the vocals on their debut. And recently, from an interview with Good Guys Go Grind from 2015, Hans is asked about what he uses to downtune his vocals, which confirms this statement and solidifies that Hans still uses this method. He says, "For my vocals, I use a whammy from Digitech. I put this device on 75% of 1 octave down, so not too low because then you get more of a round sound, and I like the sharp edges of the vocals. Also, I not only do deep growls, but I also high pitch scream, and if that goes through that whammy, you get a very nice effect." Now, I did do a general search for whammy from Digitech, and it brought up this pitch shifter pedal, which states the Digitech whammy effects pedal gives you hair-raising dive bomb effects, gripping pitch bends, and lightning harmony shifts. Now, I am not totally sure if this exact pedal is what Hans uses now, since that interview was almost 10 years ago, but if you are interested in buying one for yourself, you can do so for about $300 US. Before I talk about the music on this album, I do want to briefly mention the 2 YouTube channels that Hans Smits has that he mentions in this interview, as I think my subscribers would find it super interesting. First channel is dedicated to grindcore bands that he sees live. There are some Last Days of Humanity shows and songs on there. There are also a lot of bands on that channel he personally recommended in this interview and that he knows from the underground scene. If you're interested in checking it out, it is called GrindTube666, and I will link it down below. Now, the second channel focuses on popular death metal bands that he has seen live in concert. What I love about this channel is if you scroll down just a bit, you get a bunch of OG concert footage from some of the biggest names in the business, such as performances from Anthrax live in 1986, Napalm Death and Morbid Angel live in 1989, Carcass live in 1990, and Sepultura live in 1992. There are many others, and I encourage you to check out the channel and see if any of it interests you. The channel is called DeathTube999, and I will also link it down below. Now, musically, this album is very reminiscent of BDM grindcore band Mortician. Now, other than the fact that they both use horror movie samples in their record, they're very similar in terms of overall tone and vibe. However, what makes them different is the reasons that I stated previously about Last Days of Humanity. The vocals being tuned down, the use of no lyrics or any real song structure, and the fact that Mortician has a more solid approach to their music, which you can see on albums such as Chainsaw Dismemberment, for example. And speaking of movie samples, I would like to talk about the movies that were referenced throughout this album. Like Mortician, Last Days of Humanity used samples from various old school horror movies to help set a certain ambiance to their record, if you can call it an ambiance. The two most famous samples that are used on this record are on the beginning and ending tracks. To begin, we have the opening song, which is called Born to Murder the World, with a sample from Lord of Illusions by Clive Barker from 1995. And this is the sample.
I should have been honest with you from the start. I wasn't born to show people the error of their ways. I was born to murder the world. I should have been honest with you from the start. I wasn't born to show people the error of their ways. I was born to murder the world.
Lord of Illusions is a neo-noir supernatural horror film, and although this movie received mixed reviews at the times, for horror movie lovers, this film is a winner. Now, what I found interesting too is there were a lot of parts of this film that were sampled among various different artists, including heavy metal group Nevermore, who used sample from this film on their album Dreaming Neon Black, specifically for their intro track of that album, Ophidian. The second most well-known movie sample on this album is on the final track, Festering Fungus Infection, which features two samples. The first being from another Clive Barker film called Nightbreed from 1990, and a monologue from Faces of Death by John Allen Schwartz from 1978. The intro goes as follows.
You mustn't! It's the law!
Fuck the law.
You mustn't! It's the law!
Fuck the law.
And the monologue goes as follows.
Counting of time is considered a crime, and the money one earned not worth a lone dime. So here they will lie for the rest of the night. Their bodies remain still in darkness and in light. But don't be afraid, for it will happen to you when all will stop as your body turns blue. The counting of time is considered a crime, and the money one earned not worth a lone dime. So here they will lie for the rest of the night. Their bodies remain still in darkness and in light. But don't be afraid, for it will happen to you when all will stop as your body turns blue, 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 as your body turns blue.
What I also love about the final track is the hidden song at the very end that follows about a minute or so of silence. This song is technically called Nothing Else Matters, which is a Metallica song that came off of their 1991 self-titled album, or it's also known as the Black Album. So this hidden song starts out as a Metallica cover, but then almost immediately it goes into complete gore grind chaos before suddenly ending. It is one of the most random ways for a band to end their record, but I think it perfectly sums up Last Days of Humanity. Other horror movie samples that are used on this album include the Lawnmower Man on the track Slithering Limbs. This is a 1992 sci-fi horror film directed by Brett Leonard and is actually an adaptation from Stephen King's 1975 short story of the same name, but it's mixed with an original screenplay from the director Brett Leonard titled Cyber God. And an interesting fact about this movie is that film mostly deviated from Stephen King's original short story. He actually sued to get his name removed from the film altogether.
This universe is mine. I am God here. This universe is mine. I am God here.
Last Days of Humanity also used this sample from the movie Brain Damage from 1988, which is about a young man who discovers a disgusting parasite that has attached itself to his brainstem. He becomes addicted to the psychedelic euphoria it produces, but in return he must feed it human victims.
Uh-oh, Brian. Now you're really losing your mind. Uh-oh, Brian. Now you're really losing your mind.
Overall, I have a lot of favorite tracks on this album, I'm not gonna lie, and it would take me even longer than this video to like break down each song and talk about each one. But I think instrumentally this album is quite diverse. It's fun and playful and absolutely a troll record. There are many songs on here that start out as like fake songs. So they start out like clean rock and roll songs, like they're going to be all calm and everything. And then they just immediately go into chaotic gore grind, blast beats, tuned down vocal toilet noises, the whole 9 yards. If you have reservations about getting into this band, then you should know that the musicians in Last Days of Humanity do not take themselves seriously at all. In fact, all Hans Smits wanted to do was to make the heaviest music the band possibly could and have a blast while doing it. Sure, this cover is nasty, it's putrid, it's disgusting, it shouldn't exist. It's completely disrespectful to the family members and the loved ones of the deceased. It should not have been leaked to begin with, and Hans absolutely should not have used this for the album cover of their debut. And yet, by saying that, I have literally defined the entire purpose of why they did it. What is extreme metal if it's not extreme? What is extreme metal if it doesn't disgust you? This album physically made me nauseous looking at it, and that is the entire point. Gore grind is one of the most extreme metal subgenres that honestly many people don't actually listen to, even in the metal community. Using pictures of the dead on album covers is not a new concept, but I understand why people do not support it. Obviously, there is a difference between having cartoon dead people and cartoon gore and genuinely real photos, but the message is all the same. And it really makes me wonder if these photos on the Sounds of Rancid Juices were actual handmade artwork. Let's say they were watercolor or oil painting. Would it change my opinion on the album art? Would I think it was less horrible? Would it be considered less graphic? Because if we can make a pass for artwork such as Butchered at Birth from Cannibal Corpse, why can we not do the same for this? What if Butchered at Birth was a real photograph? Can you imagine? Would that be considered worse than what we have seen on Sounds of Rancid Juices? Regardless of the gore, if you are interested in starting your journey in gore grind or just diving into one of the most extreme metal bands in this niche subgenre, then I encourage you to listen to Last Days of Humanity and their debut, The Sounds of Rancid Juices Sloshing Around Your Coffin. Overall, I give this record a solid 7 out of 10. I would re-listen to this over and over. I don't think it's a masterpiece by any means, but I definitely think it's very fun. It's brutal, and I really enjoy the diversity with the tracks on. If I'm looking for music that's like Mortician but more muddy and grittier and a little bit less put together, then I'm picking up this record. So that's all for today. I really appreciate you watching and supporting the channel. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Let me know what you think about Last Days of Humanity and the gore grind genre as a whole, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, you guys.